For nearly 3,000 years, an empire that once stood beside Egypt and Babylon was reduced to a handful of scattered mentions in the Hebrew Bible. The Babylonians were remembered, the Assyrians were remembered, the Mycenaeans were remembered, the Hittites were not. A civilization that commanded armies of charioteers, that corresponded with pharaohs as equals, that fortified a capital on a rocky outcrop in the heart of Anatolia, had effectively vanished from the human record. Then the spades came down at Boğazköy in 1907, and the cuneiform tablets began to speak. What they said, and what the bones and the genetic data and the climate records have added in the decades since, has not produced the tidy rediscovery story everyone expected. It has produced something darker. The disturbing thing is not that the Hittites were lost. It is what they were doing before they were. The scale of the forgetting is the part that has to be understood first. By the middle of the second millennium before the Common Era, the Hittites were one of the great powers of the Late Bronze Age. They controlled most of Anatolia. They pressed southward into Syria. They corresponded with the courts of Egypt and Babylon as recognized equals, complete with formal treaties, dynastic marriages, and the kind of administrative paperwork that empires only produce when they are confident of their own permanence. Yet for nearly 3,000 years after their fall, almost none of this was known. The Hittites survived in the historical memory of Europe only as a name in a few verses of the Hebrew Bible, mentioned alongside the Canaanites and the Jebusites as one of the peoples who had occupied the land before the Israelites. That was the entire record, a handful of scriptural footnotes. The rediscovery happened slowly and almost by accident. In the 19th century, scholars began noticing references in Assyrian commercial records to a land called Hatti, a place that had clearly mattered to the Assyrian traders of the early second millennium. Then came the tablets. Cuneiform inscriptions began surfacing across Anatolia, written in a language nobody could read, in a script that was familiar but that produced no intelligible Akkadian or Sumerian when translated. The puzzle was the language itself. By the late 19th century, museums in Europe held growing collections of these tablets, and nobody knew what they said. The breakthrough came when the German archaeologist Hugo Winkler began excavating the ruined site of Boğazköy in central Turkey in 1907. What he uncovered was a royal archive. Thousands of cuneiform tablets, preserved by the fire that had destroyed the city, sat in storerooms waiting to be read. In 1915, the Czech linguist Bedřich Hrozný announced that he had deciphered the language. It was Indo-European, older than any other recorded member of that family, older than Greek, older than Sanskrit, older than Latin by more than 1,000 years. The Hittites had not merely existed. They had left behind the oldest written form of the language family that would eventually carry English across the world. The rediscovery was a triumph. The disturbing finding came afterwards. Unlike the Egyptians, whose descendants still live along the Nile, or the Greeks, whose biological and linguistic continuity from the Bronze Age into the present is now measurable in detail, the Hittites left almost no traceable continuation. Their ruling class did not survive the collapse of their state in any genetically detectable form in modern Anatolian populations. Their language disappeared so completely that it had to be reconstructed from baked clay. Their cities were not inherited. Their gods were not retained. Their kings were not remembered by the peoples who lived where they had once ruled. A civilization powerful enough to fight Egypt to a standstill at Kadesh had been erased so thoroughly that even the existence of the empire was a scholarly suspicion until the tablets were read. The question the rest of this story has to answer is how. How does an empire of that size vanish that completely? The answers are not comfortable. The first disturbing finding is internal. For nearly a century after its founding, the Hittite state was eating itself. The story begins, as nearly all reconstructions of the Hittite Old Kingdom must, with Labarna. He ruled a small territory in north-central Anatolia in the early to mid-17th century BCE. According to a later document known as the Telepinu Proclamation, he conquered the lands around the ruined site of Hattusa, absorbed several neighboring kingdoms, and held the lands of his enemies in subjection to his might. His successor, Hattusili I, moved the capital to Hattusa itself, drawn by its rocky outcrop, its 7 springs, and the forested hills that would provide his city with timber for centuries. His grandson and chosen heir, Mursili I, inherited the work and extended it spectacularly, marching down the Euphrates, sacking Aleppo, and finally sacking Babylon itself. The old Babylonian Empire, the empire of Hammurabi's descendants, collapsed as a direct consequence. By any external measure, the Hittites had arrived as a serious power. Then the killing began. Mursili returned from Babylon to find his own capital restless. He was assassinated in Hattusa by his brother-in-law, a man named Hantili, who took the throne the same day. Hantili's eventual successor, Zidanta, murdered every remaining descendant of the previous royal line, methodically, to ensure no rival claim could surface. Zidanta was then assassinated by his own son, Amuna. Amuna's sons were in turn murdered by the next ruler, Huzziya I, whose own reign was brief. Almost a century of dynastic murder, each generation slaughtering the one before it, each new king ascending over the corpses of the children of the last. The damage was structural. The Hittite state did not have the institutional depth of Egypt or Babylon. It depended on the king. When the king was killed, the army was idle. When the army was idle, the borders were open. While the Hittite royal house was occupied with the systematic murder of its own heirs, the Hurrians were establishing themselves as a serious regional power on the southeastern frontier, raiding deep into territory the Old Kingdom had recently conquered. The conquests of Hattusili and Mursili were undone, not by external defeat, but by the absence of any king sober enough to hold them. Around the year 1525 BCE, a monarch named Telepinu seized the throne in what the records describe as a bloodless coup. He attempted to legislate the violence out of existence. The Telepinu Proclamation established formal succession laws. The firstborn son of the king's first wife was to inherit. If there was no such son, the throne passed to the son of a concubine. If there were no male heirs at all, the husband of one of the king's daughters was to be adopted into the family and rule. It was a careful document, written by a king who had clearly watched too many of his predecessors die. The laws did not work. Telepinu's own son was murdered. He died without an heir. The bloodletting resumed. The empire would eventually recover, but the rot had already shown itself. The first disturbing finding about the Hittites is that they nearly destroyed themselves before anyone else got the chance. The Hittites were not a peaceful people. The historian Trevor Bryce noted that for the Hittites, fighting one's enemies was as regular and natural an activity as cultivating the soil and worshiping the gods. War was not the exception. It was the state of affairs. Campaigning was undertaken every year outside the winter months. Martial prowess was the principal qualification for kingship. Many a Hittite monarch established and consolidated his rule by leading armies into the field personally, often within months of his coronation. The army was built around 2 components. The vast bulk of any Hittite force consisted of infantry, equipped with sword and spear, occasionally with battle axes or maces depicted in surviving reliefs. Behind the infantry came the chariotry, the elite arm for which the Hittites became famous across the ancient Near East. The chariots themselves were lightweight constructions, wooden frames covered with stretched animal hide, fast and highly maneuverable in open ground. The technical innovation that distinguished them lay in the placement of the axle. While most other Near Eastern peoples mounted the axle at the rear of the vehicle, the Hittites positioned theirs at the center. The change increased stability enough to allow each chariot to carry 3 men rather than 2, a driver, a spearman, and an archer. The result was a mobile striking platform that could break enemy formations and inspire the kind of panic that decided battles before they were fully joined. The sophistication of the system is best preserved in a document recovered from the Royal Archive at Hattusa. The manual is attributed to a horse trainer named Kikali and is the oldest equestrian training text in human history. Its 24-day regime specifies diet, exercise schedules, and even nocturnal practice drills, all designed to produce chariot horses capable of sustained performance under battlefield conditions. The document is meticulous. It is also evidence of a state that had institutionalized the craft of war to a degree few of its contemporaries could match. Then comes the disturbing finding. The Hittite war machine required something the Hittite heartland did not possess: manpower. The population of central Anatolia was never large enough to sustain the empire's military commitments. This is why the vassal treaty system became so elaborate. Conquered states were bound by oath to provide troops on demand in exchange for Hittite protection. When the system worked, it produced victories like Kadesh in 1274 BCE, where Muwatalli II deployed a reported 475,000 troops and over 3,000 chariots against Ramesses II. When the system failed, and it failed often, the Hittite kings found themselves with armies stretched across fronts they could not defend, calling up reserves from a civilian population that could not afford to leave the fields. The structural implication is the part that should not be skipped over. The Hittites had built an empire that could only survive by waging war. The wars they waged required a population they did not have. The vassal system papered over the deficit for as long as the vassals were willing to bleed for them, and not a day longer. The state was not merely militarized. It was structurally dependent on conquest to feed itself, and dependent on coercion to keep its own borders manned. The disturbing material darkens here. Two findings from the cuneiform record have changed how historians read the final century of the Hittite Empire, and neither of them is comfortable. The first is the plague. During the reign of Suppiluliuma I, in the mid-14th century BCE, a bacterial disease the Hittites called the tarmia swept through the empire. The illness arrived during a period when Hittite armies were already exhausted by decades of campaigning against the Mitanni and the western Anatolian states. It spread through the army, then through the cities, then through the countryside. It killed Suppiluliuma himself. It killed his successor, Arnuwanda II. It continued to kill for decades afterwards, depopulating villages, hollowing out garrisons, and reducing the empire's capacity to field the armies its vassal treaties demanded. Mursili II, Suppiluliuma's younger son, eventually inherited the throne. He inherited the plague with it. Several of his prayers survive in the cuneiform record, addressed directly to the gods, asking for the epidemic to be lifted. One of them contains a warning so blunt it borders on threat. If the gods, my lords, do not remove the plague from Hatti, the makers of offering bread and the libation pourers will keep on dying, and if they too die, the offering bread and the libations will be cut off from the gods. The king was telling his deities that if they did not save his people, they would soon have no people left to worship them. The second finding is darker. During his campaigns against the Arzawan states in western Anatolia, Mursili II is recorded as driving plague victims into enemy territory. The reference is brief, but it is unambiguous. The Hittites, suffering an epidemic they could not stop, weaponized it. The episode is the earliest documented case of biological warfare in human history. The implications of this should not pass without comment. A state that cannot defeat a pathogen but deploys it against its enemies is a state that has accepted the deaths of its own people as the cost of military advantage. The infected men driven into Arzawan territory were Hittite subjects. They were the empire's own. Mursili sent them across the border knowing they would carry the disease further, knowing they would infect the people they encountered, and knowing the same disease would continue to circulate inside his own borders for years afterwards. The mathematics of the decision are the mathematics of a state with no margin left. The plague was not stoppable, so the plague became a tool. The wider context makes the calculation harder to dismiss as mere desperation. Mursili was not a tyrant. The prayers he composed are among the most introspective texts to survive from the Bronze Age. He genuinely believed his gods were punishing his people. He genuinely searched for what had been done to provoke them. And in the same reign, in the same campaigns, he ordered the use of disease as a weapon. The Hittites were not unique in suffering plague. They are unique in being the first civilization we have evidence of using disease as a weapon. The disturbing finding is not the suffering. It is the calculation that followed it. Hittite religion is usually described as syncretic. The standard explanation is cultural openness. The actual explanation, preserved in the texts the Hittites themselves left behind, is fear. A prayer composed by King Muwatalli II names 140 separate deities. The vast majority are local variations of the storm god, gathered from across Anatolia, Syria, and the conquered territories of the south. The Hittites did not adopt foreign gods because they were broad-minded. They adopted them because they could not afford to forget any of them. The scholar trying to describe this mentality has called it a strategy of safeguarding the state from the displeasure of some forgotten deity. The risk of disaster from neglecting a single god somewhere was simply too great to bear. The solution was theological accumulation. Cover every base, pray to everyone. The practice that followed from this theology is where the disturbing element appears. When the Hittites conquered a territory, they did not merely defeat its armies and impose tribute. They carried the cult statues of its gods back to Hattusa. The official justification, recorded in the texts, was reverence. The new gods would join the Hittite pantheon and receive their proper offerings. The functional consequence, never stated quite so plainly, was hostage-taking. By physically holding the statues of foreign deities inside the capital, the Hittites prevented those gods from assisting their former worshippers against future Hittite campaigns. The religion of the empire was, in operational terms, a system of spiritual extortion. The gods of conquered peoples were kept where the Hittites could watch them. The rituals that surrounded this enormous pantheon were unrelenting. Over 100 religious festivals took place each year. Sacrifice was the central act. Sheep, goats, and cattle were led to the temples in procession, accompanied by musicians, and slaughtered by priests who turned the meat into stews for the divine table. The blood was not discarded. It was poured into pits as libation. It was thrown over the temple walls. It was poured directly onto the cult statues as a method of ritual cleansing. Bread was dipped in blood and offered on the altar. One text describes a kind of sacred sandwich, with 2 loaves placed on the table and the liver of the sacrificed animal laid between them. The image is domestic and unsettling in equal measure. The festivals themselves combine the solemn and the strange. One ritual involved a temple official bathing naked in beer. Another involved a sport the cuneiform texts describe as cheese fighting, the rules of which remain genuinely unclear. It may have been a contest in which cheese was used as a weapon. It may have been a kind of ball game. The tablets do not specify. Boxing, wrestling, shot put, and weightlifting are also recorded as ritualized competitions at religious gatherings. The picture that emerges is not the picture of a confident state at ease with its place in the cosmos. It is the picture of a civilization that lived in perpetual anxiety about its supernatural standing, hoarding gods the way a paranoid regime hoards informants. The vast Hittite pantheon was not evidence of generosity. It was evidence that the people who built it never believed they were safe. The Hittite collapse around 1180 BCE was not a single catastrophe. It was a convergence. Several disasters arrived in such rapid succession that the empire had no capacity to absorb any of them, let alone all at once. The political pressure came first. The rise of Assyria under Tukulti-Ninurta, the first in the late 13th century, pushed directly into Hurrian territories that had long been under Hittite suzerainty. Tudhaliya IV attempted to hold the line and was defeated at the Battle of Nihriya, an embarrassing reversal in which his vassals and allies appear to have abandoned him on the field. The Syrian vassal states that had supplied the empire with grain, tribute, and troops began to slip from Hittite control. At the same moment, a rival regime, led by Tudhaliya's cousin Kurunta, established itself at Tarhuntasa in southern Anatolia, fragmenting the Hittite political core from within. Then came the findings that have only recently been integrated into the picture. Dendrochronological data and paleoclimate records from across the eastern Mediterranean now show that the region was struck by an extended drought beginning in the late 13th century and continuing for decades afterwards. The Hittite heartland, dependent on rain-fed agriculture in central Anatolia, was among the worst affected territories on Earth. The crops failed, the herds shrank, the granaries that had supplied the army emptied. The Egyptian pharaoh Merneptah is recorded sending emergency grain shipments to the Hittites, a startling reversal of a relationship that had been one of military rivalry only 2 generations earlier. The empire that had fought Egypt to a standstill at Kadesh was now accepting Egyptian charity to feed its own people. Then the Sea People arrived. They were themselves, almost certainly, refugees of the same climate crisis, displaced populations moving in coordinated waves down the Mediterranean coast in search of land they could occupy. The Hittite coastline could not hold them. The Kaskians, the mountain-dwelling peoples of the Black Sea highlands who had raided the empire for centuries, pushed in from the north at the same moment. Hattusa, the great rocky capital that had stood for more than 4 centuries, was burned to the ground, sometime around 1180 BCE. The administrative tablets that had been preserved by earlier fires were preserved again by this one. The empire that produced them was not. The disturbing genetic finding follows from what came afterwards. Unlike the Mycenaean Greeks, whose biological descendants remain measurable in modern Greek populations, the Hittite ruling class has left very little detectable genetic continuity in modern Anatolian populations. The cultural memory survived in the Neo-Hittite states of Carchemish and the Syro-Hittite kingdoms for several more centuries, until the Neo-Assyrian Empire under Tiglath-Pileser III absorbed them entirely by the late 8th century BCE. The people themselves, the population that had filled the cities and worked the fields and provided the soldiers, dissolved into the populations that surrounded them. The Hittites did not fall to a single enemy. They were undone by climate, plague, dynastic decay, and structural overextension, arriving at the same moment, in the same decade, in a region that no amount of cuneiform paperwork could save. The disturbing thing about the Hittites is not any single finding. It is the pattern. A civilization that built one of the great empires of the Bronze Age, that wrote the first equestrian manual in human history, that pioneered legal codes which appear to have influenced the Hebrew Bible, that fought Egypt to a standstill and signed the world's first surviving peace treaty, was nonetheless erased so completely that its own language had to be reconstructed from baked clay. The cuneiform tablets preserved the kingdom's voice. The genetic record suggests the people themselves did not survive in the way the Mycenaeans did. The climate data explain why the timing was unsurvivable. The plague texts explain what the empire was willing to do to its own population to stay in the fight. The Hittites are not disturbing because they were monstrous. They are disturbing because they were ordinary, and ordinary was not enough.